listening to the podcast Advertising Playbook, your resource to better understand and execute successful podcast ad campaigns. Hello and welcome to the podcast Advertising Playbook. I'm your host, Heather Osgood, and today on the show I have Brett Robinson. He is the Senior Vice President of Ad Operations at National Public Media, which is the sales arm of NPR. Super excited for my conversation with Brett today. Welcome to the show.
Yeah, thanks for having me, Heather. Really excited to be here. I love the show.
Well, thank you so much. So I'm really curious. I always like to find out kind of what led people into the podcast space. So can you just take us on a little bit of your journey into what got you to where you are today?
Sure. Well, fled the cold after college to go to LA and worked in the media sales and media buying space there for 5 years or so. I eventually moved back to the East Coast to DC to be closer to friends and family, and quickly took a software sales job that I can only describe as soul crushing. A lot more cold calling than I think was in the brochure, and was really struggling. And I'd always had kind of an interest in working for a mission driven company. And I had a little bit of a light bulb moment that the best part of my day was really listening to NPR on the way to and from work. So I knew they were based in DC. I applied to a few jobs here. The only one I could get an interview for was an associate level operations position. And so I took a pay cut of about half to work on NPR's brand new digital sponsorship business. And I guess the rest is history.
Wow, that is so cool. And I love that. I mean, I think that so often we get into jobs. I mean, obviously, totally human nature. You get into a job, you don't really love it, but you just kind of keep plodding along year after year. And so it's really neat to hear that you were able to kind of assess where you felt like you were maybe going to be able to contribute the most, but also, be fed a little yourself. And it does seem like working on that kind of mission-driven content is a really neat place to be. Do you feel like that has kind of contributed to your love of the medium?
Yeah, I do. I think getting the NPR slant to it has really been enriching, I guess is really the best word. And to kind of see the podcast space through a place like NPR, where just a building that you walk into and there's such a buzz to the newsroom, and tiny desk concerts playing over in the music wing. And so, yeah, it's been a really gratifying experience to kind of learn podcasting through the lens of NPR.
Yeah. I think one of the things that's always been really fascinating to me about NPR is, at least from my vantage point, NPR was a pretty early adopter of podcasting. I started my career in radio ad sales many years ago, way before podcasting, but it seemed to me like NPR has always really understood audio. And I think that that's what I've always loved personally about listening to NPR, is that the way that they create content is so audio centric. And it obviously was this very natural progression for NPR to say, hey, let's release this as a podcast. And it seems like from the beginning, really, it was about kind of repurposing that terrestrial radio content and making it into podcasts. But I guess I'm curious, why do you think that NPR was such a big player in the podcast space from the beginning?
Yeah, I think you really hit it on the head, because we've been at it a really long time is the obvious answer. Whether it's terrestrial radio, streaming, or podcasts, these are all, at the end of the day, just different ways to consume spoken word audio. I think you could argue podcasting is a slightly different format, but NPR, yeah, has a 50-year heritage of audio journalism starting on the radio. And I think all those years of kind of honing our craft of authentic storytelling, and that really created a unique opportunity for NPR to be a leader here. I started working here about 15 years ago, and the first thing I had to learn is, what is a podcast? Because back then, we weren't doing anything super sophisticated. It's kind of what you talked about. We were taking radio broadcasts of shows like Fresh Air or Wait, Don't Tell Me, and just creating digital audio files of those. And people were listening on their computers and their iPods, if you can remember back in those days. And there wasn't a lot of traffic, and there was even less sponsor interest at the time. Shout out to Acura, who was our first ever major podcast sponsor. But we were testing and we were learning, and soon we started launching shows that didn't even have a broadcast radio component. They were digital first franchises, and Planet Money and All Songs Considered were a couple examples from those early experiments that are success stories and are still pretty popular today.
Yeah, yeah, that is so neat. And so I mean, really you started, I would say, I mean, at the beginning of podcasting, right? You've been able to watch the journey. And as I guess as it pertains to advertising in particular, I'm really curious what you've seen change. I mean, I love that you gave that shout out to Accurate because I mean, I know, gosh, even at True Native Media, which was about 7 years ago when I started the company, I remember like those first few months, I would just cold call people and say, "Hey, you want to buy podcast advertising?" And companies literally had no idea what podcasts were. And I would be like, "You're the marketing person here. You don't know what a podcast is." So I can't imagine what your journey has been like. What have you seen change over the years?
Yeah, well, I think the biggest thing really has just been the investment in research and measurement as the scale of podcasting has increased and more ad dollars has started to pour in. There really became this huge need for more accountability with respect to measurement and analytics. You can probably remember 6 or 7 years ago, we were all defining what a download was a little bit differently. And so even just creating a universal definition of that metric with the IAB was a big step. And then of course we've seen this huge evolution from like promo codes to this more sophisticated pixel based attribution tracking. And I think that was a really big step too. 5 years ago, we were doing a lot of debating with brands about whether promo codes kind of told the whole story of performance, and I still think they're a really important piece of the puzzle, but maybe just not the whole story. Back then I think a lot of impact from podcast buys was being incorrectly attributed to things like social or paid search because it was kind of that like last click attribution model, and we were operating in a medium where nothing was clickable, so that always
Mhm.
makes it a little bit harder. And so, you fast forward to today, we've seen this huge investment in pixel based attribution that can kind of help try to capture that entire full impact. And it's certainly not perfect, but it's been a big step forward. And I think what's been cool is that measurement is good for brands, but it's also really good for publishers too, because we can see what's working and what's effective. Today at NPR, we've run over 3 billion impressions through attribution tools. And so now we have all kinds of learnings about what works and what doesn't. We have really good analytics around like what's the optimal frequency and share of voice of a buy, what programs and audience segments are going to perform best for different industries, how often should you refresh your creative. And so compared to that promo code model of several years ago where the brand would just kind of tell you whether it's working or not, there's a little bit more of an opportunity to consult and collaborate and make mid campaign changes and try to make a podcast buy really effective for a sponsor.
Yeah, yeah. I love hearing about all of those changes. And, obviously, we've all been kind of right there with you. But I also find it really fascinating. And I think one of the great parts about an institution like NPR is that with 3 billion, you said 3 billion impressions served, right? And being able to track those through that pixel tracking and to create these stories around what works and what doesn't, I think is really important. So, one of the questions I've always had is NPR is a nonprofit organization. And because you're a nonprofit organization, that changes the way that you can run ads, which is a little different, right? It has to be more of like an underwriting type ad. How does that work?
Yeah, so NPR is a nonprofit, though technically I work for National Public Media, which is our for-profit subsidiary that manages their ad sales and operations. But yeah, our sponsorship is a little bit different from what you'd hear on a commercial podcast. We do have a few hosts that read the ads, but no one who is an NPR journalist reads their own ads. And then the other distinction is we don't do endorsement style ads. And, I think those certainly work for a lot of publishers, but for us, we really feel it would erode the trust that our audience has in NPR that's so important to us. So we have two announcers, shout out to Chioki and Kara, who are amazing, that read all of our digital audio spots. And
I did
I
not
think our
realize you only have 2 people who read all of
yeah,
your spots. I should maybe know
yep.
that because I should recognize the voices, but interesting.
Yep, aside from the few hosts, yeah. So, we really feel that like at this point our listeners kind of think of them as part of the NPR family. And we've done a lot of testing with our friends at Veritonic, and we actually see that these announcers produce similar recall to our host reads, about 18% above Veritonic's industry benchmarks. And in fact, for some industries like financial, the announcers actually outperform the hosts. So that's kind of the standard model, I guess, if you will, 15s and 30s that are
Mhm.
straightforward messages about the features and benefits of a product or service. But I think overall, there may be this like perception that NPR is a little bit basic in their sponsorship offerings because we're a nonprofit, but I don't think that's necessarily the case. We transact in actual dollars, not tote bags, and we have some pretty unique solutions for our sponsors. Along with the standard 15s and 30s, we do a lot of more custom audio formats too that give brands some different options and really lean into what I think listeners come to NPR for, which is our storytelling. So I'll give you one example. We have a product called Brand Soundscapes where we interview someone who is really passionate about the brand, maybe an employee or a customer who had a really good experience, because we find that that passion translates to really good audio. And so we capture that conversation and we create 30 and 60-second mid rolls out of it. And then we make the long form version available on the web as kind of a click to play display unit, and it gives our listeners a chance to hear like the more human sides of brands, I guess.
Mhm.
And a few examples like a mom who was really blown away when Target launched an adaptive clothing line that accommodated her son's feeding tube, or a BetterHelp therapist talking about how gratifying it is when their client says, I've never told anyone this before, but, and they know that they've kind of made a real connection, or the almond board talking about how they make their product more sustainable by using the nuts husks as livestock food. And so, yeah, we find that these soundscapes can be really effective as a branding tool, but we also have seen really good results for DR advertisers, especially when they're kind of combined with a heavy dose of that traditional promo and offer style spot.
Yeah, okay. Well, so that's great to hear. I always go back to when I started True Native Media. I named the company True Native Media because I was obsessed with Gimlet podcasts. And I remember the first handful of times that I heard Gimlet ads that they had created where I literally was like, is this part of the show or is this an ad? And, as someone who had been in advertising for, I don't know, 15 plus years at that point, I should have been able to pick up on what was an ad and what wasn't an ad. And so I love that style of advertising. Anytime to me the ad feels more like content than an ad, I think there's a lot of power there. And for the point that you bring up is that it is all about storytelling, right? I mean, audio at its core is about listening to a story, period. And if you can take that advertiser message and make it feel more like a story and more intriguing, then people are going to listen to it more just because they're intrigued. And when it's created in a similar style to the content, it makes the listener feel like, I really think it makes the listener feel like the content creator cares about their listening experience, right? And when we've got these more forced ads that tend to come through, it doesn't feel that way. And so really when we get down to the core of it, that's a better relationship between the advertiser and the podcaster and the audience. And I think that that's really what creates a strong win. So I love to hear that you guys are working on that and that they've created a lot of those very successfully.
Yeah, thanks. And agree 100%. I mean, I think that's the balance we kind of have to strike as an industry as automation and programmatic and things like that become more prevalent. It's like there's going to be more opportunities to insert different types of ads seamlessly into your content. But then
Mhm.
at some point, it may be at the expense of that kind of authenticity that has made podcast advertising really effective so far.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. I love that you piggyback that with the DR advertisers though. And I think that's always been a big question mark for me is would DR be as interested in something like an NPR style show because is it harder to track? And, definitely it sounds like that it's not, and that you guys have had a lot of success with DR advertisers just as you have with these other forms of ads.
Yeah, we I think a lot of that too is I think we're pretty sophisticated technically, which always helps if you're able to get the ads in front of the right audience. We do the standard kind of baked in ads for the sponsors that want that type of presence. But more than half of our business is dynamic insertion with a heavy emphasis on demographic and psychographic targeting through our ad server AdsWiz. We even do things like transcription based targeting based on the content of each episode. So a fitness brand could sponsor episodes across NPR's catalog where that episode focuses on health, nutrition, exercise, things like that based on the episode's transcript, which is pretty cool.
That's really
And
cool.
yeah. So we really try to offer that mix of like contextual targeting and database targeting because we think it's important to do both. You could reach business decision makers while they listen to Planet Money, but that same audience is also going to listen to entertainment content and you want to reach them there too. I mean, I'm I guess a podcast ad ops decision maker, but I don't only listen to programs about the podcast industry and ad tech, right? I mean, everyone likes likes
Come
to be
on, Brett.
entertained
You
as
have other
well.
interests besides this? I don't know why.
Imagine that. Imagine that. So, when you bring this back around to the DR question, yeah, I think we've had a lot of success there. I guess I'll start with we do get a lot of brand dollars. I think we get a lot of brands taking advantage of the trust that our audience has in NPR, kind of capitalizing on what we would call the
Mhm.
halo effect. Basically, that brands that sponsor NPR are really viewed by our audience as supporting our mission, and our sponsors see really good results because of that transfer of trust from NPR to them. And we've been doing all these really cool studies the last couple of years that kind of test implicit subconscious neuro connections between brands and attributes tied to trust. And we found that listeners really do have this deep trust in NPR far more than something like a cable news network. And that trust transfers to our sponsors and really makes their ads more memorable to our listeners. And so our studies show double digit increases in recall over something like a cable news network. But when you think about it, a host-read endorsement is kind of tapping into the same thing, right?
Mhm.
It's that trust that the audience has in the host transferring to a product. I think our transference of trust is more from the brand to the product. On the brand side, I think we were actually a little bit ahead of the curve when it came to brand dollars. I think a lot of other publishers were seeing the DR money flow in first and then
Mhm.
the brand, but we had a bit of a head start because we had some really deep relationships with a lot of Fortune 500 companies based on years and years of radio buys that showed really good results. But probably more importantly, we had really good answers to the measurement questions from brand advertisers early on. We have a listener panel of over 12,000 people who have volunteered to take surveys periodically to help us make our content and our user experience better. And so we tapped into that on the podcast side going all the way back to 2015. And we were able to offer sponsors a lot of visibility into brand lift, brand awareness, brand recall. And sure enough, the results were really good. And a lot of B2B textile companies have actually told us over the years that we've helped them build their business based on that association to NPR's brand. But flipping to the DR side, I think it works on the DR side too.
Mhm.
One thing that we've looked really closely at is the importance of corporate social responsibility to sponsorship. And 90% of Gen Zers prefer to purchase products with an environmental or social benefit. And I think that means that they're more likely to buy products from NPR sponsors because they really view them as having that positive social impact because the brand is supporting a mission driven nonprofit. And then I think you combine that with just what I mentioned before about really leaning into kind of consulting and really collaborating, I guess, with a brand. What we do is we really try to make it a soup to nuts experience, especially for a DR brand who's going to be really, really interested in the results from the start. So we'll do panel-based copy testing before a campaign launches so that we're leading with the best possible, most effective creative.
Hmm.
We're going to work with sponsors to make sure that they get the most bang for their buck when it comes to things like targeting, getting the share of voice right, getting the frequency right, getting the program mix right, and really setting them up for success. One tactic we'll actually try pretty often is do a run of network placement across all of NPR,
Hmm.
all NPR programs, and then after say 4 to 6 weeks, we'll take a look at the attribution data and we'll say, okay, what programs are really popping for you all? What's driving the most success? And then we'll kind of optimize the campaign into the programs that are really working. And so, we're able to actually move the needle during the campaign and then also kind of have a blueprint for any future renewals. So we can kind of count on that performance going up and up with each subsequent campaign because we're trying to apply the learnings from the previous buys.
Yeah. Gosh, I love that. I think that that's such a great strategy to buy run of network and then see what really works. I find that smaller advertisers sometimes have a harder time with that because they don't have the budget to buy the whole network. But man, if you can, I think it really does, like you said, it really shows you what works well. And once you have that learning, then you can apply and obviously create more successful campaigns because you know this show is converting. And then also, hopefully you can take that and apply it to other campaigns that you're going to run maybe outside of NPR or, just elsewhere in the podcast space. So I think making sure that you've got that is really it's an important piece there. I know you talked a little bit about dynamic ad insertion and your targeting capabilities, and I didn't realize that you guys had the ability to do contextual targeting. I think that that's a really big missed opportunity in this space. I know, gosh, back in the day when we were selling more embedded, I would have advertisers who would say things like, "Hey, I only want to run in episodes where they talk about this particular subject because that aligns better with my brand." And I always felt a little bit like, number one, that was very hard to do because getting a podcaster, at least an independent podcaster, to tell you like what their topics are going to be is pretty tricky. But then also, I think there can be, if it's a little too matchy, right? Like if you're talking about some specific health idea, and then you're like, oh, and I have this product that actually answers that question, if it can feel a little canned. But I think the way you guys are doing it, it isn't. It's just one of those, I think probably more from a psychological basis. People are like, oh, this is a cool product. So how does that, I guess, there's always talk about the difference between dynamic insertion and programmatic. And I think people lump them together a lot. But it sounds to me, and you can correct me if I'm wrong, that you don't do programmatic ads, meaning an announcer read ad from an ad server somewhere isn't going to just land in an NPR show. You are going to always work with the advertiser, that you have a lot of programmatic targeting capabilities that companies are used to when they buy programmatically. Is that correct?
That's correct. Yeah. I mean, I like to think of us as we almost act as our own kind of mini network in
Yeah,
our own right. And we have the scale where I think we can
sure.
kind of do that, where you can say, okay, I only want to reach these certain niche segments within an NPR, and we actually can have some pretty decent scale there. We actually do programmatic ads,
Oh,
but we
you
kind of
do?
do it our own way. And by that, I mean, we need to record the creative and we need to vet it through our guidelines. So the term I use for it is program manual, in the sense that the creative portion is manual, but then from there you can kind of take advantage of all the automation and efficiencies that programmatic offers. So it's kind of private marketplace and programmatic guaranteed style deals, not
Mm.
the real time bidding open auction. That's, I guess, what a lot of people think of as programmatic. I think the other part of your question that you're asking is whether NPR would ever consider that like more traditional backfill, real time bidding. And I think the answer is only if we could really find a partner that would play by our rules, allow us to voice our own creative. I just don't ever see a world where we're going to be taking client supplied ads that you hear on commercial radio. It would just sound out of place. And I think it would erode that trust that I keep talking about that
Mhm.
our audience has in us, that we value so highly.
Yeah, no, I totally agree. And I think that that's a really good call because the name of the game in NPR is trust, right? Your audience is there because they expect to receive something. And if that audio that is being delivered doesn't align with what they're expecting, then how are you different than any other audio organization out there, right? So yeah, I totally agree. So I guess I'm curious from someone like yourself who has been in the industry for so long. I know you've been in a lot of the conversations and a lot of the tables where the industry as a whole has been discussed. I'm curious, what would you say are some of the biggest challenges that we as an industry are facing as it pertains to advertising in particular?
Well, I think we started to hit on one with it, which is just like, what is the role that programmatic is going to play,
Hmm.
right? Um, and I think the answer is it's up to us, right? I think we have a little bit of a blueprint of like both the good and the bad of what we've seen over the last 10 or 15 years on the display side. And it's important to distinguish between like programmatic tech and then programmatic ad quality, which I think of as two very different things, right? Like programmatic at its essence, it's a good thing. It allows us to transact campaigns more seamlessly.
Hmm.
But on the display side, I think it led to a world where we prioritize cookies over context, right? It became less important to reach someone in a reputable environment and more just about targeting someone who had been on a shoe website with a shoe ad, regardless of what website they're on now. And it became a little bit of a race to the bottom in terms of CPMs. And there became this kind of immense pressure to fill every single ad opportunity, which led to a lot of publishers really lowering their standards for what kinds of banners they would take. And of course, a bad audio ad is way more jarring than a bad display ad.
That
I
is
guess unless
true.
it I guess unless it's that bad display ad that auto plays audio. We've all had that happen when you're in the middle of a meeting and something from your browser rises from the dead. But I think you see where I'm going there.
Yeah.
And I think to draw another parallel to a similar industry, commercial radio has gradually evolved to where the ads are to some extent a little bit just about like who can shout the loudest. And the first
Mm,
thing you end up doing when you get to those ad breaks, generally on the radio, is to look for another station. So I think it's up to us to kind of take advantage of the good of programmatic, which is buying at scale, buying against niche audience targets at scale, delivery verification, all the stuff that really like breaks down barriers to track transacting sponsorship buys, but then not rush to jam up all of our unsold inventory to the brim with commercial radio style ads that are just going to condition listeners to skip the ads.
right.
Um,
I had Gabriel from Edison Research on the show recently, and one of the things that we talked about is that in their research, the percentage of people surveyed who said there were too many ads increased significantly. I mean, I think it was like either like 10 or 12% of people in prior years had said that there were too many ads, and now I think it's up to like 34% of people say that there are too many ads. And I do think that while I'm a huge proponent that we need to be monetizing podcasts, and I obviously think ads are a good way to do it, we have to be really careful about oversaturation. And I think that's something that both the advertisers and the podcasters should be thinking about. If you're looking to make an ad buy, you want to make sure that you're not advertising on a show that's oversaturated with ads, because that really is going to have a big impact on the success. And again, for the podcaster, I think it's really important. Obviously, we've been talking about trust as it pertains to NPR and the listening experience that people expect on NPR shows. But that, I mean, that is the case for any podcast, right? You're establishing trust with your audience. You are delivering a content experience when they tune into your show, and you need to make sure that you're delivering that. And if all of a sudden one day you've got 7 ads jammed into this 30-minute show, half of which are like, Geico and Progressive, I think people like that's going to turn people off. And it sounds to me like that's what you're saying.
Yeah, I mean, I think an uncluttered environment is just so important, especially given that this is a medium where listeners have a skip button. And every time you skip an ad, you're becoming more likely to skip the next ad too. And so it's kind of on us as an industry not to incentivize those listeners to know where that skip button is. I think one of the concerning things as podcasting has kind of gotten bigger and bigger, and you've seen more and more dollars flow into the space for talent acquisition. We've all seen the nine-figure price tags that people are paying for shows. Is well, now you need to get some return on your investment, and the only way you're going to do that is by putting a lot of ads in there, and that's not really good for the industry. I mean, we take a really hard stance that it's one 30-second ad per about 12 to 14 minutes of content.
Mm.
And, that's very intentional. We want the user to say, okay, an ad's coming on, but I know it's going to be over soon. It's not even worth getting my phone out and skipping and trying to find where the content starts on the other side because it's a really lean ad break. And so I think that's a big part of our value proposition.
Yeah. When I was doing newspaper sales, so I had started in radio and then I moved to newspaper. And I remember in newspaper, there were such strict rules about editorial to advertising content. And I never was in a conversation when I was in radio about content to ad breaks. It was always just like, however many we can get in. I mean, granted, there were caps, we would sell out for sure, but it didn't feel the same. And I do sometimes really get nervous when we have more of that radio mentality creeping into podcasts where it's just like, hey, let's just fill it up. Because obviously, like you said, we all know that we can skip ads. And the way I look at it, if I'm listening to a podcast and I hear an ad, I'm like, oh, it's an ad. If I hear a second ad, I'm like, oh, it's a second ad. If I hear a third ad, I'm like, where's the fast forward button? Like, it's just like there's a tolerance level. So I think to your point, like setting it up so that the listener is like, yeah, I can hang in with this, this short break. I can hang in. And the goal obviously is to bring products and services to our audience that they're actually going to be interested in, that they're going to want to buy because they're going to feel like they're great products. But yeah, all of this comes together to create successful campaigns.
My boss uses a phrase called moral debt or ethical debt. And it's the idea
Ah,
that if you make a decision to double the number of ads in your podcast overnight, or maybe take ads that sound really out of place there, you're going to, in the short term, make more money, but you're likely going to pay a price for that down the line with your users. And I think as our monetization options continue to expand, as all these barriers start to come down and there's all these different programmatic options available that
mhm.
help you monetize your show, I think we kind of owe it to ourselves as publishers to remember what made podcast ads so effective in the first place, that they actually sounded authentic, like that they were ads that sounded like they're made for podcasts, and that there wasn't all that many of them. And I think that's what we got to be really careful about.
Yeah, totally, totally agree. And I just, and the last part too, that there wasn't all that many of them, right? Like we do have to really focus on that. Any other challenges that you see or any predictions that maybe you have for the industry?
Well, let's see. I think in terms of challenges that we face, I think the biggest thing is really just managing all of the things you need to do to grow your audience in the face of increased competition. And whether
Hmm.
that's finding new platforms. I think the biggest challenge for us in particular is really trying to grow our audience, but also diversify our audience and trying to meet users where they are on all kinds of different platforms. We've started to experiment a little bit more with YouTube. I mean, we have a really young, diverse audience on the Tiny Desk concert franchise. And so for us, it's been a little bit about like, well, how do we convert some of those people who only think of us as a music brand to try to broaden them out? So, I think just the daily lift of producing so much content that pivots off the news and trying to find an audience for all of that content.
Hmm.
In terms of predictions, I think it's just we've seen such explosive industry growth these last few years. So many new podcasts launching, big price tags being paid for shows. And candidly, some companies may be chasing what they saw as easy money. I think you might see a little bit of industry contraction here based on the current economic climate. I think one of the great things about podcasting is it's a platform that has a low barrier to entry, right? A microphone and a dream, and maybe some good technical and production chops to go along with that. But I also think podcast listeners can generally tell the difference between good journalism and bad, good audio quality production and bad. And with so much choice out there, whatever it is, over 4 million active podcasts now, I think it's
Mhm.
probably going to start to get a little bit harder for shows to keep finding an audience unless they're really, really good or able to differentiate themselves a bit from what's out there, because discovery is just going to get harder and harder. I think for NPR, it's really our network. We work with hundreds of local member stations across the country. We have bureaus all over the world, and we can kind of tap into that network when breaking news unfolds and try to get the complete story and all the nuance that comes with it, because we often will have, someone kind of on the ground that's been living and breathing that region and that event.
Yeah. Yeah, for sure. I mean, that definitely is the advantage that NPR has is the network that is behind you, right? All of the people. But so interesting. So if somebody is listening and they're like, "Gosh, I really would love to advertise on NPR shows," what's the best way for them to go about doing that?
Hit me up, brobinson at npr.org, or straight to our sales team, sponsorship at npr.org. We also have a really good website kind of laying out all of our different offerings, nationalpublicmedia.com. So those are all good ways.
Okay, awesome. Well, Brett, thank you so much for being on the show today. I appreciate it. It's been a great conversation. And again, just so impressed with what NPR has been able to create in this space and really looking forward to what you guys continue to create.
Thanks, Heather. I really appreciate it. And I really do love the show. I've kind of gone down the rabbit hole listening over the last couple months. And I've tasked our ad ops team with having everyone listen to an episode and give a little bit of a report out, because I really just think there's a lot to learn in your show. I think you probably know more than anyone in the industry at this point, just by virtue of talking to all these personalities across podcasting.
Oh, that's awesome. Well, thank you so much, Brett. It's such a fun show to be able to create. And I'm so passionate about the industry. And I just think that it's been so terrific to be able to offer this information to both podcasters and advertisers, because as interesting as podcast ads are, it isn't simple. And at some point, maybe it will become simple, but right now it's not. And so being able to help kind of unpack that information has been really a great thing to do. So I appreciate that.
Yeah, and it's also an industry that I think it's been really nice to see it does kind of collaborate and lift each other up. And I think there's this sense of shared goal, and everyone really wanting to help each other out and grow podcasting as a platform, which has been really cool to see over the last 5 or 10 years.
Yeah, I totally agree. It is. It's really a collaborative space, which is terrific. So awesome. Well, thank you for being on the show today.
Thanks again, Heather. Take care.
Thank you for listening to the podcast. I hope that you have enjoyed this episode as much as I have, and that you have learned some valuable bits of information about NPR, as well as how you can get started in podcast advertising. If you would like more information about podcast advertising, you can head on over to truenativemedia.com and download our podcast ad guide. Thanks for listening, and we'll catch you again next time. Thank you for listening to the Podcast Advertising Playbook, your source to a better understanding of the podcast advertising industry.